Gojo vs Makima. No matter what side of the internet you found yourself on in the last few years, countless threads and videos have depicted this matchup to hundreds of thousands of views. And with Death Battle's take on this literally coming out tomorrow, whether you know nothing at all about them or you're a super fan of both, I want to do something completely different to catch you all up to speed. Compiling every single argument and facet of these characters established over the years of debating, from their introductions right up until their respective end in the story, to give you a total breakdown on their wide list of abilities, as well as a recap of all the information you'll need to determine who could actually win the Death Battle, and maybe even change your mind as to how close you really think this matchup could even be. So if you're ready for the most overly analytical breakdown of this topic you'll ever see, and want to hear a legitimate mathematical breakdown of how many days this fight would even take, then just sit back, relax, with a cold drink in hand, as I recount to you the epic tale of the strongest modern sorcerer versus the mastermind of the Devil Hunters. Now, no matter what angle we look at this fight, the most key factor presented is clearly going to be Makima and Gojo's respective abilities. Since, for those who don't really know the characters super well, these two are sort of notorious figures in and out of their franchises for being so utterly broken that in many ways, they broke their own stories after stealing the show from the protagonist. So while we will definitely get into who can punch harder and run faster later on, this entire first section will be used broadly to explain how they fight to better understand the arguments for their interactions. Timestamps should be down below for your rewatching convenience though. And as you'll see why in a bit, we're sort of forced to cover Gojo's abilities first. So, for Satoru Gojo, since the very day he was born, he was a very special man. A once-in-a-millennium talent born to the Jujutsu world that possessed abilities so unbelievable that his mere existence permanently changed the balance of power in the hero's favor forever. If there was a scale, he could break it. A skill, he could learn it. And in terms of strength, he alone was honored above all. This isn't left up to question or debate. Literally every single person within his world respects Gojo as the greatest, to such a point where people have to put asterisks besides their titles for clarification, such as Naobito, the fastest sorcerer besides Gojo, or Yuta Okotsu, the strongest sorcerer besides Gojo. This is likely because in the world of Jujutsu Kaisen, about 80% of a person's combat ability is derived purely from natural talent. And what this meant for Gojo, in a world where humans can control spiritual energy to put the hands on any number of ethereal ghosts and spirits, is that he was near the pinnacle of Jujutsu sorcery, and the genetic qualifications that gave him this edge were twofold. The Six Eyes, a trait so rare that two people on Earth haven't and couldn't ever likely have it at the same time, plus of course, the Limitless, Gojo's own innate curse technique which he was born to wield, as well as sort of being the source of all of his more iconic abilities. For the sake of the diehard fans though, I'd like to talk about Gojo's Six Eyes first, as it seems to be the less explored half of his abilities, despite being undeniably the more valuable half, especially for a fight like this. Because, as the manga explains, the Six Eyes operate basically like two mini super processors for all information, giving Gojo the unique ability to see cursed energy flow down to an atomic level. This gives Gojo some minor abilities like discerning someone's curse technique and how it works through sight alone, and also telling apart different types of people by their cursed energy signatures. The more important factor of seeing this spiritual energy at an atomic level though, is that the Six Eyes aids the user in precisely controlling cursed energy on that level. This helps Gojo use his energy with great control and efficiency, to the point where it's stated that even though Gojo only has about a quarter as much cursed energy as someone like Sukuna, he literally just can't and won't ever run out of it, because his eyes are capable of endlessly dissecting and managing the use of it to the point where the amount of expended energy is infinitesimally small. This is also ignoring that a user of the Six Eyes is granted eyesight akin to a super detailed heat sensing camera, which is why Gojo can see through that blindfold if you were curious. And unlike the Limitless, these eyes are entirely passive and can't be deactivated, basically meaning Gojo can differentiate stuff from kilometers away and predict the movements of things in his presence from sight alone if his eyes are revealed to open air, on some Sharingan-esque kind of crap. Why all this matters though, especially in this particular fight, is because having infinitely low cursed energy usage gives Gojo access to an ability which he keeps active perpetually, called Reversed Curse Technique. Now, I'll explain why he has to keep this ability on at all times later, but for now, all you need to know is that because Gojo can't ever run out of cursed energy from his uber precise control of it, he can cast this ability 24/7, which reverses the effects of ailments on the body. This can be as simple as reducing brain fog and fatigue for nights with no sleep, to precisely clearing out poisons and even healing his body from actual damage, as serious as the loss of entire limbs or organs. By this logic, Gojo only really has 2 weak points which can actually be considered fatal blows, one being in the area of the stomach where all of the spiritual energy flows from. If someone were to say, cut him in half, then Gojo most likely couldn't heal from it, at least immediately. And the other is the origin point of all curse techniques, the place where Gojo actually has to pilot his powers and tell the energy that starts in his body where to go. To explain that though, I think I should probably go back and describe the second piece of Gojo's power set, his innate techniques, since for most people who know Gojo, this is what they know about him. Because while the Six Eyes are a very rare and uncommon ability in JJK that provide the user a great deal of power on their own, Satoru Gojo was born not just with those special eyes linked to fate, but instead with the other techniques of his clan as well, the much more flashy and iconic Limitless. Now, on its own, you could describe the ability of Limitless as the concept of bringing a paradox or infinity into reality to manipulate or alter space. And while all that sounds really complicated, it basically just amounts to pushing, pulling, and teleporting things for most users. The most basic application of this power is called Infinity, and it's sort of Gojo's calling card. It's also sort of the best way I can explain his powers to you without exploding your brain. So, when bringing the traits of Limitless into reality, this is the natural application. What would occur if Gojo is not trying to do anything special with his technique besides activating it? It essentially serves as the power to stop things, the midpoint between a push and a pull. While lots of people try to overcomplicate it with mathematical explanations given within the series, it basically amounts to this. Once Gojo activates this ability, it forces anyone who tries to interact with him to play by his simple rule. Anything that wants to touch him will have its velocity halved over and over as it approaches. Using Gojo, the place they want to hit as the number 0 in this case, if someone is 1 foot away from Gojo, as they try to approach, they would become half a foot away, then a quarter a foot away, then an eighth a foot, a 16th, and so on and so forth, because no matter how much you divide the distance between two numbers or two distances, you can't ever get to 0. The rules of this barrier technique basically work like that. If you don't care to know exactly how it works though, just think of it like a restraining order on every character in fiction that they can't get around conventionally. However, as I said, Infinity is the natural application of Limitless, so what happens when these traits of Limitless are applied to attacks? In Gojo's case, he has 2 major ones inherited from his family tree. The Lapse of Infinity being blue, which creates a hole in space to pull things close and twist them violently, with this power being applied to everything from projectiles to telekinesis, as well as even using it to coat his fists in hand-to-hand combat, which makes his punches nauseatingly painful on top of hard to avoid, and the ability to coat his whole body in this blue for short to long range teleportation. The other inherited technique he possesses being the reverse of Limitless, which is red. It's twice as powerful as blue and basically works by forcing new space into existence, causing the displaced space to rapidly repel around it, outward like an explosion. But the thing that sets Satoru Gojo apart, however, what made him this worldwide figure of power he is not just either of these abilities on their own, but the use of both traits, the Six Eyes and the Limitless, in conjunction, as when put together, they can escalate a user's power level to well past story-breaking levels. And this finally comes back around to what I was talking about earlier, as the biggest weakness of the Limitless technique is its very costly nature. Red takes double the energy of blue, blue takes more energy than Infinity, and Infinity will literally fry the user's brain from overuse if kept on for any extended period of time. But if your name is Satoru Gojo and you possess the Six Eyes, granting you the highest level of control over your cursed energy and techniques to the point where you basically have the infinite stamina hack enabled, well then you can basically get around all of these weaknesses and gain the sort of hype that only characters like Goku and Saitama have really maintained, at least within the anime community. The biggest offender of this is Gojo's use of passive Infinity. Like I told you before, Infinity is the neutral mode of the Limitless technique, and it basically creates an intangible divide between Gojo and the whole world. But upon mastering this ability, Gojo was able to move its processes from the conscious side of his brain to the subconscious, allowing him to convert infinity into a perpetually active ability, bypassing his brain-frying issue entirely, with reversed curse techniques perpetually healing the damage that occurred to his brain over time. This is also where the lore behind the untouchable man Satoru Gojo really began, because as early as chapter 7, Gojo basically fully established that the infinity which exists between him and his enemies is a wall that, while now indefinitely active, makes him unbeatable. This is also why, as we learned in the fight with Kashimo and Hikari, Gojo's second weak point would be his brain, as his techniques from healing to infinity derive purely from there. And while we'll talk about how you can get around the infinity barrier soon enough, the last powers we need to cover for Gojo are the other two that derive from the combination of Six Eyes and Limitless: Hollow Purple and Domain Expansion. As you might guess, if you've been through a 3rd grade art class, purple is the combination of red and blue, brought about by the precise atomic combination of negative and positive mass to create an imaginary mass. While I know that sounds really awfully complicated, it basically amounts to this. Imaginary mass is in its own nature imaginary, so it can't exist, and it will violently twist and rend through space in one linear direction, destroying most things in its path, including itself, until it's gone. And although it can be argued that this is a form of existence erasure in itself, I believe the series does contradict that, with Sukuna being able to tank and survive multiple of these later in the manga, as well as the simple idea of Purple being able to receive a power-up from Nakime's curse technique. Unlike the hyper-precisely composed Purple, however, Domain Expansion is a whole other beast that throws precision out the window for the sake of a pure, chaotic devastation. In some ways, you could say this is the peak of any Jujutsu sorcerer's arsenal, and to sum it up in a roundabout way, Gojo creates a black orb around himself and the target that's about a dozen or so meters wide, and within the interior of this barrier, a visual illusion of sorts is formed. In Gojo's case, with the unlimited void domain, it portrays the entirety of the universe to those trapped within, being fed then an infinitely long string of information over time, courtesy of those Six Eyes, which threatens to completely destroy the brains of anyone who can't escape out of the incredibly resilient barrier. Whew! After all that, I'd say anyone listening should probably have a very basic understanding of Gojo's two intertwined abilities. Blue pulls, red pushes, purple plows through things, his eyes enable infinite stamina cheat, plus let him see really far, and his infinity means you can't touch him. As long as you got all that, you should be good. And while actual battle power is ironically not super important for this matchup, I'll give you a few quick scales for his strength and speed so you have some context on both contestants. In Gojo's case, his best feats are pretty simple, with the likes of a cursed spirit named Jogo and the powerful king of curses Sukuna being able to wipe out entire cities with singular attacks. Considering that Gojo was able to turn someone even more durable than Jogo into a splat on the wall with just his raw cursed energy, city level is a very safe estimation of his abilities, with higher metas being totally passable here, such as domain scaling or this black hole feat, but it's not really super relevant like I said before. Speed, on the other hand though, is quite important to Gojo and the whole matchup in general, as it's pretty hard to argue someone could win a fight if they're getting speed blitzed constantly. Especially in Gojo's case, considering his unbeatable defense operates like an automatic door. So if you were to move so fast that Gojo's atomic detecting eyes couldn't see you, then his automatic defense wouldn't even know to trigger. And I mention this now because, in a slight spoiler, I don't really think it would dramatically influence the fight, as Gojo has 3 pretty clear and distinct directions you can scale him, all of which correlate pretty nicely with Makima's own interpretations. At the lowest end, as the fastest Jujutsu sorcerer with magic super eyeballs, he should transcend the dreaded Mach 3 statement, as mentioned for the cursed spirit Naoya, straight on the pages of the manga. A lot of people have contention with this though, as later we see a character named Hikari, who is slower than Gojo, react to multiple bursts of cloud to ground lightning. This second meta would suggest Gojo should be around Mach 364 as opposed to Mach 3 to 10, quite casually, at least in terms of his reaction speed. And as long as you don't mind the contradictions from the first meta's manga statement, this is mostly valid. The last meta, however, is based off of the aforementioned black hole feats, as characters like Kenjaku could actually react to an FTL black hole, with later feats such as Sukuna dodging EM waves or imaginary mass destroying itself near the speed of light in the real world, all pointing to the favor of at least Gojo thinking near the speed of light. No matter what meta you decide to use really, it should be pretty clear that unless you're very disingenuous to Gojo's scaling, without some insane speed, you aren't going to be blitzing JJK's finest. But of course, this is only one side of the matchup, and to neglect Makima's genuine advantages, as many seem to do, would be a disservice to her very, very intricate toolkit. So, for Makima, I believe the place to start is no different than that of Gojo. Since, for people who don't really know her, or even if you just really haven't read both series closely, the parallels between this girl and this guy don't really seem too obvious on face value. And while I know this will seem kind of insignificant for fans, pay very close attention to what I say, because these parallels and Makima's worldview unironically play a pretty huge role in how this match could play out. As, from the very first page that Makima comes into the fold, she is the narrative catalyst who pulls the strings and controls the protagonist's introduction into the world of Chainsaw Man. Living in a universe where, much like Jujutsu Kaisen, the fears and thoughts of humanity culminate to create powerful monsters that terrorize the world known as devils. And as the leader of the Devil Hunters, the group made to fight off and end the stories of these beasts, Makima at some point during her life would come to a very similar crossroad to what Gojo did in his youth, forced to decide how far they would go to create a utopia. And while Gojo would never fully descend into that dark place of sacrificing those beneath him for the sake of an ideologically perfect world, Makima was a person who both narratively and literally had lost her humanity, with that all culminating in the ultimate plot twist of her true nature as the Control Devil, seeking out the titular Chainsaw Man for his unique ability to consume a devil and erase its existence forever. And as we found out in another shocking scene where we learned Chainsaw Man had already erased the idea of things like nukes and Nazis in the past, Makima wanted this power for herself, all in an attempt to create a perfect world where no one would have to feel the loneliness she did, being forced to stand atop the natural power hierarchy of the world, as she literally viewed every human beneath her as nothing more than a dog. This is all extremely, extremely important for one reason, which is Makima's own power set as a devil, which fortunately for us breaks down nicely into two groups just like Gojo's powers prior. And similarly to Gojo, I'd like to address her own biological abilities before talking about any kind of techniques she possesses. And in her case, this actually specifically means her devil powers, because Makima has the mystical abilities of control. Just like the devil of tomatoes would have the powers of a tomato, Makima is the devil of control, with her power giving her complete dominion over all those she views as inferior to herself. And this power was how she planned to take control over Chainsaw Man and bring about her perfect world, as anyone who falls under its effects are basically rendered as nothing more than puppets to her will, bound to her by the soul through these mysterious looking chains, right up until and even long past the point of death. This also has nothing to do with the physical or spiritual strength of her target, as it's entirely down to her perception of the individual she's fighting. And because Makima literally can't tell humans apart from sight, just as we can't tell dogs apart from their faces, Gojo could potentially be under threat of falling for this, which we'll talk about in the later conclusions. This ability basically means in short that Makima has access to the powers of countless other devils at her disposal through the forms of contracts she's forced them to make with her control powers. This is her second set of abilities. But before we move past Makima's own natural abilities as the Control Devil, it's important to note that unlike a Jujutsu sorcerer who's entirely human aside from their manipulation of cursed energy, Makima has the natural strength and fortitude of a devil. And as we see very early on, devil hybrids like Chainsaw Man can casually survive being blasted through buildings, with even stronger ones like the complete Chainsaw Devil and Gun Devil being able to level huge chunks of cities quite casually, while not even mentioning the idea of something like a Nuke Devil possibly being just as strong as the thing it's actually based on. In Makima's case, she scales to or above all of this, as she can go directly 1v1 with any of these devil hybrids and even fight the complete Chainsaw Devil at one point or another. Similar to Gojo, she has higher metas as well, such as using the Falling Devil calcs, which was able to cause effects around the entire globe by just appearing, or even higher end calcs of some of the weaker devil's attacks, but again, not very relevant, since even though she can literally put a hole straight through Denji with her fist, that hand is never going to collide with Gojo, so she'll need another way around, which, spoiler, she probably does. Devils also, on top of all these other traits, possess a superhuman healing factor that is no different than Gojo's reverse curse technique, except she doesn't need her brain to work with that. But we'll talk about all this more in her second section regarding her powers and contracts, since Makima's healing is a bit different even among devils. However, while still talking about Makima's physicals, I'd like to mention the speed scaling for her, since I made the claim earlier that she could definitely not blitz Gojo. This is because, if you just go with a lowball interpretation, you can look at the countless bullet blocking and or dodging feats within Chainsaw Man and simply try to upscale Makima from there, with the best one I'm personally aware of being Quan Chi blitzing a ton of people, which often calcs out to about Mach 6, with this putting Gojo and Makima fairly close at a lowball. But if you were to try to be a little nicer to Makima, you could easily gauge her speed to around Mach 300 based off of the Gun Devil being able to traverse the world and level cities with its speed, or, if you just really like Makima, you can get her to about Mach 1500 based off the speed of the Gun Devil's attacks, using its giant weapons that can cover about 500 kilometers in 2 seconds. As you can see directly comparing these numbers on screen though, Gojo and Makima remain almost exactly even unless you highball Gojo to these light speed metas where he reaches around Mach 350k, so I don't think a blitz is too likely at all. But, like I said, all the way back towards the beginning of this matchup, traditional face-punching stats don't matter here, at least not that much. And as I've implied throughout, it's not just because it's all a one-sided stomp in the favor of Gojo and his unbreakable defense. Because, while Gojo is undoubtedly broken, and many a character in fiction literally just can't hurt him, Makima's arsenal is about a mile wider than even his, so let's address it. As of her peak in the story, Makima had a grand total of 10 separate contracts that we 100% know about, through the use of her Control Devil abilities, as well as one additional power that I want to talk about here since I'm not really sure if it's supposed to be another devil power or part of her own. Now, of those 10 contracts, we can pretty much immediately rule out 6 of them, because well, like I said before, Gojo is still pretty much untouchable to a majority of fiction. These 6 contracts include the Snake Devil, which summons a giant snake to eat a target, which wouldn't be able to work on Gojo because Infinity would block that, the Zombie Devil, which brings back the dead as zombies, which of course only works if Gojo dies, and the 3 Weapon Devils, since Katana's explosions and arrows don't work on him because of Exhibit A, Infinity. And the Punishment Devil, because we don't really know what it does, so it gets an honorary mention. This also applies to any other devils like the Curse or Fox Devil that she could have but isn't mentioned. I'm not going to bring them up because we don't know if she has them. Now, on to the 5 powers that can actually be put to more use here than just a distraction. And let's start with the most powerful one, that likely sparked this debate for many in the first place, Makima's contract with the Prime Minister of Japan. In the year 1997, when Chainsaw Man takes place, Makima made a contract with the Prime Minister to protect herself from the concept of death altogether, by transferring any kind of physical ailment to a random Japanese citizen in her place. So if Makima were to, say, die 29 times in a row in her fight with the Gun Devil, this would be nothing but a drop in the bucket to her, as Makima would and could simply regenerate from the damage sustained instantly at that point. So, as I'm sure you're probably wondering when I say that, how can you actually beat Makima then? Does she have a weakness? Does she have some sort of limitation? No. The answer is no. Not really. Short of negating her healing factor or deleting her from existence, she can come back from literal nothingness, with this passively active contract still being online while she's reduced to nothing but steak-sized bits, only prevented from reforming due to regeneration nullification hacks by the form of the Blood Devil that Gojo obviously doesn't have access to, giving Makima, in effect, her own infinite lives cheat. It's also the reason why strength doesn't really matter here, as while Gojo can't be touched, Makima will automatically transfer her damage, no matter how minor, to another human of her Japan. So if you, the person watching this video, were to fight Gojo and Makima, your level of strength would be equally as effective as someone like Spider-Man or Darth Vader, since disregarding speed, their hacks would nullify it all the same. As for her other contracts, you can split them pretty much evenly into the categories of support and defense. For her support abilities, she has the Spider Devil and Future Devil. The Spider Devil can be used to teleport Makima anywhere that she chooses to leave the Spider Devil, so this can be used to effectively escape from dangerous AoE attacks like Purple or Domain Expansion, whereas the Future Devil can, as you'd guess, see very far into the future. It's unclear how much Makima can grasp from the Future Devil, but there's not much reason to assume that she can't apply its abilities similarly to Aki, the person she controlled it from, in which case she can see seconds into the future to avoid attacks more effectively, as well as serve to balance out the 6 Eyes boost to Gojo's perception. For her 2 offensive powers, these would include the Angel Devil's abilities as well as the unknown telekinesis power she has. For the Angel Devil, it's quite simple. Makima can create weapons through the sacrifice of lifespan collected by those the Angel Devil had interacted with during its life. These weapons possessed magical properties that may or may not be able to play a role in handling Gojo, from katanas that can cut ghosts to sabers that can steal lifespan, or spears that can even harm Chainsaw Man. Regardless of if they'd work though, Makima should still be quite good at using them from her Devil Hunter experience and Future Devil assistance. For her telekinesis powers though, very similar to Gojo, Makima's main bread and butter fighting techniques all revolve around this weird, nameless psychic power. She can point at someone, causing them to be launched backwards by a powerful blast. She can sacrifice living humans in a ritual to use her force powers in a long-distance voodoo way, although this only seems to work on very weak people. Or she can literally just look at you kinda funny and you start bleeding from the inside out. And as we saw in the manga, she was able to damage the Darkness Devil with this ability, and blow apart low-ranking fiends with ease, so its level of power shouldn't be underestimated in comparison to Gojo's, even if his telekinesis is a bit more flashy looking. While obviously kind of debatable as to if this attack is a projectile that Gojo could perceive and stop, if you don't believe Infinity would block it, or just believe Makima's telekinesis works like most telekinesis powers, being able to push the target directly without contact of any kind, then this is Makima's go-to way of winning the fight. And speaking of it, whew, geez, we're finally here. If you've managed to make it to this point in the video, just don't forget Makima makes magic weapons, has the force, ate 126 million 1-ups, and can see the future, plus she's very smart. Knowing all of that, you're now fully caught up to speed, no matter where you were before, on all the lore and abilities revolving around these 2 characters. So after that, I think you deserve to know who I believe would win in the hypothetical death battle, as well as get the answer I promised all the way back at the start of this video about how long exactly the battle of Untouchable versus Unkillable would actually take. With all of their abilities and informations now on the table for you to see, here are my thoughts. To me, it seems clear that in a straight confrontation between these 2, Gojo's abilities are far more suited to an actual 1v1 battle. His Infinity is an inherent edge, as Makima isn't going to have any idea of what kind of insane resistance it provides for him until far after the battle has begun. And while Gojo also wouldn't exactly have much of an idea as to why Makima could keep getting up from his attacks, unlike Gojo, whose reserves of stamina and Infinity are as limitless as his technique's name implies, Makima only has 126 million Japanese citizens to reflect her damage upon, and if that sounds like a lot, it is. But in the most fundamental comparison of their abilities, this right here is where the fight and all win cons must stem from. So what ways can Makima get around Infinity before Gojo beats all 126 million lives out of her? To answer this, we can actually look at all 3 win conditions for Gojo and determine how long each would take, then see if Makima's plans can fit into that time frame. So for the most basic and obvious answer, knowing that Gojo can compete with Makima physically, his first way of winning is by brute force, with every punch, kick, and purple whittling away at her citizen count until she eventually runs out. Viewing this contract like a health bar for Makima, it's sort of tricky to determine the exact numbers on how many lives Gojo could take per minute, but fortunately for us, during the Shibuya incident, we get exact numbers on how long this sort of thing might take. As over the course of exactly 299 seconds, Gojo is able to slaughter a count of 1,000 transfigured humans, while unimpeded by outside sources. So, with all of his focus on beating down Makima at a similar rate, By simply dividing the population of 1997 Japan by Gojo's unaliving rate, we get the ridiculous number of 437 days of Gojo having to punch straight through Makima at maximum power. That's around 14.5 months or a little over a year of Gojo beating Makima. And while this number could change a little bit if Gojo stops fighting for any extended periods of time, at its face value, this is about how long Makima has to complete any one of her win conditions. To get this out of the way though, Gojo does have 2 more possible win cons, which I'll mention here, that could maybe influence that number. His domain expansion and cursed energy by itself. If Gojo uses his domain, one of 4 things is likely to occur. 1. Gojo makes Makima brain dead and wins instantly. 2. Makima is unaffected as she can literally remember things that don't exist anymore, likely implying a level of knowledge that is very, very expansive. Far more so than any sorcerer this move has worked on in the past. 3. The middle road of both. Gojo's domain might work on her just to a less effective degree, making it basically useless here. Or 4. The information sent to Makima will just kill Japanese citizens and not affect her at all for that reason. The common thread for all of these, barring the brain dead ending, is that domain expansion won't be enough to end the fight with Makima, and since overusing it can actively nerf Gojo, I believe he probably won't try to rely on it in this fight as any sort of win condition, even ignoring the fact that Makima could just escape it with the Spider Devil and predict it using the Future Devil. This leaves us with the third and final way Gojo might have to end this fight, which is an exorcism. It seems sort of obvious since it's literally Gojo's job, but if you believe Gojo's spiritual energy attacks the soul and can thusly purify it rather than just doing it with brute force or damage only, Gojo will likely exercise the Control Devil very, very quickly with one of his many spiritual attacks, or using purple if you think it's an existence erasure attack like some do. So, depending on your interpretations of all these factors, Gojo seems to have a relatively straightforward number of ways to win. By comparison though, we have Makima, who can't even physically touch Gojo, and is 100% on the clock. So what countermeasures does she possess that could possibly grant her that W? The first and most major of these is pretty simply her natural control powers. If you do believe Makima wouldn't or couldn't bother to take the time to distinguish Gojo as anything more than a human, or if she could just really hype herself up I guess, then Makima will instantly neg the strongest sorcerer and end the fight. I just don't really believe that this is a super likely outcome though, because Makima is highly implied to see Denji, the human form of Chainsaw Man, as a dog as well. But she never succeeds at taking control over him or even tries to because of his devil powers, making him scary or threatening to her on a surface level. This means, simply enough, that either as soon as Gojo attacks, or if Gojo's power smells like something different to Makima, then this would revoke Makima's potential control, as even people weaker than her like Quan Chi or Rize still got a chance to fight Makima, as Makima had to prove her own superiority to herself to use the ability. This is all to say, Makima probably won't just neg Gojo this way, but she could under selective circumstances. With access to the Angel Devil and all of its weapon-producing abilities, we've already seen Makima demonstrate an extreme aptitude for making and wielding a variety of these tools, on a scale that even the Angel Devil itself couldn't seemingly replicate. And as we see within the context of Jujutsu Kaisen, there are at least 2 separate occasions where a cursed tool, being Toji's Inverted Spear of Heaven and Miguel's Black Rope, can bypass the Infinity blatantly. So while it's not entirely clear if Makima could recreate a weapon like this, or how much lifespan something like that would even take, if she could either cancel out Gojo's curse technique, or find a way to cut through or bypass the space, then this fight becomes a whole lot more close, with either long-range spears, swords, or other tools at her disposal, which she could feasibly use to fend off and harm Gojo at mid to close ranges. Her last option for a win though, is not really too much different from her second. Force manipulation. With her telekinetic attacks and the finger gun things she loves to do on her opponents, not only do we see a wide range of effective damage dealing options, but as we saw during her fight with Darkness Devil, with a barrier very similar to Gojo, Makima was still capable of hurting it through that passive defense. And whether you think Makima could only do a little damage with minor TK, or full-blown blast Gojo into space like she did versus Denji, is purely dependent on your interpretation. But hearing all this though, I think it should be sort of clear where I stand. While Makima might have a lot of separate lives backing her and a wide arsenal of abilities at her disposal, even being as generous as we can to her, granting infinity bypassing weapons and full contact telekinesis, these aren't instant win cons against Gojo. In his own world, Gojo has fought many characters who can get around or blatantly bypass his infinity, yet was still considered the strongest. Whereas Makima has never had to face someone with the stamina and firepower to effectively end all 126 million of her lives in one go. And honestly, this applies to everything she can do. From the Angel Devil's lifespan running out, which would take all her weapons away, to Gojo being able to destroy any devils that fully manifest like snake or weapon hybrids. Whereas Gojo can't lose anything. Even being so uncharitable as to say Domain Expansion, Purple, and Exorcism don't work on Makima, he could still very feasibly outbox and unalive her enough times with no special help that the fight would end in his favor. So while I do think this fight is closer than many would depict, with Makima being able to hang in there close with Gojo using her initial resources, I believe it's more than likely that Makima runs out of options long before Gojo does. And unless you believe this devolves into a hilarious and pedantic battle in the court system for Gojo to change his Japanese citizenship, then I would have to say, if I was a betting man, that Satoru Gojo will win the death battle. But be sure to tell me what you think down below. I could have always missed some things, and while you're down there, be sure to subscribe for more content like this. And that's all for today. Thanks, everyone.